Welcome to another episode of Bloomberg Intelligence Vanguards of Health Care podcast, where we speak with the leaders at the forefront of change in the healthcare industry. My name is Jonathan Palmer, and I'm a healthcare analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence, the in-house research arm of Bloomberg. I'm thrilled to welcome AJ Loiacono, the CEO and co-founder of Capital RX, to the program today. AJ is a serial entrepreneur with more than 2 decades of experience in the world of pharmacy benefits and healthcare technology. And since its founding in 2017, Capital RX has been one of the fastest growing companies in this space. I'm really excited to dive deep into the world of PBM, so welcome to the podcast, AJ.
Thank you for having me, Jonathan.
So maybe let's just jump right in. With one sentence, what's the mission of Capital RX?
The mission of Capital RX is to give our country the infrastructure we need for the healthcare we deserve. And just to kind of clarify that, I always want to make it very apparent that we could think of hundreds of brilliant ideas to improve healthcare, but good luck implementing any of them on our aging infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I identified early on is if we truly wanted to advance or evolve healthcare in this country, we need to move off of systems that are 30 to 40 years old.
Good start. So maybe let's peel back the onion there. And so when we talk about the healthcare system and we talk about PBMs, can you maybe set the table for us for where the PBMs fit in the industry and where Capital RX fits within that landscape of PBMs?
Yeah, I always want to take it, as high as you can go up to, for people to kind of think through their own personal experiences day to day with healthcare. And so I often say there are 2 electronic workflows in the United States for healthcare. The first one is what we call EMR, EHR.
Right.
This is your experience at a doctor's office, or it could be a health system, a hospital setting. And this is the system to what I call create a claim in the U.S. healthcare system. So these are systems that do things like scheduling, decision support. But the moment a prescription is prescribed or you have some sort of procedure done, you have created some sort of insurance claim in the United States, and it disappears from this workflow and it moves over to what I call my world, which is claim administration, the electronic workflow to administrate a claim. And before we go into pharmacy, it doesn't matter if it's medical or pharmacy. You're doing the same tasks. You're doing eligibility. You're managing networks. You're billing someone. You're reimbursing someone. You're doing plan design and accumulators. So this is that electronic wrapper or infrastructure. So where does Capital RX sit in there is that we started on the pharmacy benefit side of this electronic workflow administrating claims. So if you think about a PBM, and PBMs often are given this name, the middleman or these mystery people, I always want to simplify it in saying an employer group or a health plan is asking someone to administrate their claims. That's what they're asking of a PBM, the M part, the management. And what that workflow, again, are these different pillars, if you will, of what I would call workflow and patient and claim and payment management. And so we started on the PBM side, and it really was for us trying to create a more transparent system, because I feel like, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, a little bit more, but there were some things wrong with the original model.
Well, maybe talk about that a little bit. How did the original model, or what maybe we traditionally think about with PBMs and what we see in media and press, how did that model evolve? Because I don't think if we started going back to your discussion about pharmacy and medical, I don't think if we started from zero, we would have these separate buckets, right?
I completely agree. And I think there's a lot of things that goes into the history of healthcare and why we are in our current kind of setting. But going to the pharmacy benefit side, nothing really makes sense in pharmacy benefits. And I have to take you on a journey with me to have you appreciate my perspective here. So I started in pharmaceutical manufacturing. I started doing the driest work possible, which is consulting and helping pharmaceutical manufacturers convert old supply chain systems. This is on the plant side. This is not cool stuff. And you would basically be converting old MRP systems to MRP2 to modern ERP systems like Oracle and SAP. And you blink and 8 years of your life goes by. But during that time, I had a first-rate education, not just in software implementation, but supply chain logistics and drug pricing. And so towards the end of my time on the manufacturing side, a friend of mine came over to me and said, "Hey, you're really good with claims data or database work. Could you help me look at this really big file?" And obviously you sign NDAs and you say, "Sure, let me help you." And I'm like, "What am I looking at?" And they're like, "This is a PBM data." And I'm like, "What's a PBM?" And they're like, "Aren't you in pharmaceutical?" And I'm like, "I'm in pharmaceutical manufacturing. I don't know what a PBM is." And this is an important point. If you ask me to describe the pharmaceutical supply chain in our country in the early 2000s, I would say it's very similar to semiconductors. The other thing is generic drug prices. And this is what really offended me. Generic drug prices change price maybe 2 or 3 times a year, and it's always deflating. Generic drugs are typically, obviously there's some limited manufactured product that may break that rule, but 99% of generic drugs are deflating. And no one understood the price of a drug. And just to finish on this thought, people ask me, like, "Well, what were you expecting?" And I said, when you go into a pharmacy, if you want to see how drug pricing should work globally in the United States, don't go to the pharmacist yet. Go to the over-the-counter section and reach for a bottle of Tylenol or Advil or eye drops, and something magical happens in the U.S. healthcare system. It doesn't matter if you're insured or uninsured. It's the same price. And the only time price will change is if actual supply and demand or market forces change that price. If you go across the street to buy Tylenol, no one is charging you $600 for a 30 tablet. And, if you want to point a finger, I always want to say, is pharma blameless in this? No, but pharma lost control of the supply chain years ago. And this is solely the work of the pharmacy benefit management industry.
Wow, that was a great synopsis. It's interesting. The example you brought up is very similar to the one that Doug Hirsch from GoodRx always brings up, where he was shopping for something that was out of network or something that wasn't covered by his plan. And he went to 8 different pharmacies and 8 different prices, and hence we have GoodRx.
Exactly right. And it's this artificial variability. And I use the word artificial because it doesn't have to be this way.
So maybe go a little deeper on how you differentiate, just versus the traditional players as it stands today, those big 3. How is that differentiated in that sales process? What are the keys that you focus on?
The first thing we needed to do was to understand this was going to take us, took us 8 years to get to a point in which we are now able to bid on any size customer. But there's no shortcuts and you have to ground yourself in that. But how are you winning, or what's the differentiator? And it goes back to this point. The first thing I say is we're aligned. When we look at a mail order file, but the point of it is this is the sole domain of the PBM. And what we find is 60 days excess, 70 days excess, 90 days excess. And people are like, "Well, is that bad?" Well, first of all, the drugs just expire. There's an expiration date. Like you can't stockpile drugs and be like, this will be used for 5 years from today. The other thing is you want to follow FDA guidelines, which typically are between 7 and 14 days, depending upon therapeutic category, what you're talking about. You should not have 89 days of excess drugs in your cabinet. And this happens all the time.
Well, I'll tell you, it happens to me. I have a maintenance script that's a 90-day script that I get through the mail, and I have way more of it than I'm ever going to go through.
And who would do this? Well, we wouldn't. We have programmatically a thing that, we programmatically have a system that looks at the day's supply that each patient has based upon the current history, and it will throttle up and down based upon always maintaining that FDA guideline corridor between 7 and 14 days. So none of our members should ever have the stockpile. So this can very easily be solved for, but who doesn't solve for it? If you're making money on drugs, you want people to have...
If you own a dispensing pharmacy...
Exactly right. You're making money twice over. You're making money on what you have kind of opened the conversation to is PBMs aren't just administrators anymore. They also are vertically integrated.
Right.
So they own maybe some retail asset, some mail asset, some specialty asset, and some what we call GPO aggregator. Sometimes they even have some sort of relabeler or white labeler for generic as well as biosims. And it's making more money on the same patients. And it is to the detriment of the plan ultimately, because if you're just an administrator, you're always going to take the lens of championing the plan and the patient.
Mm-hmm.
We want to give the patient the best service, best oversight, best education, best chance of outcome, and we want to deliver the lowest price for the plan and the patient. This is, our charge as the administrator. But the moment you make money on drugs, I will say you immediately have bias. It is a textbook definition of a conflict of interest if you get a better financial outcome for decision A versus decision B. And so this is what we started to educate the industry on, but you have to compete on price. I always say this is, you have national brokers and consultants that run these RFPs, and if you're not competitive, you're not going to win. And so you first compete on price, then you compete on service, and historically then you compete on fiduciary kind of obligation and ethics, you know what I mean, which is, are we aligned? I think that order is starting to flip a little bit, where you're seeing larger payers become concerned about, because remember, I always like to point this out. No one is buying drugs 20 or 30% cheaper than someone else. Drug pricing from what I would say the administrative side is quite competitive. So what you're really looking at is a game of inches, like 2% savings for this person versus 3%, in a competitive RFP at the finish line. So if the finish line is tight, what is beginning to be overweighted is the reverse, where, okay, that was kind of like the prerequisite or table stakes of,
sure, your ante to just be part of the RFP.
Yeah, like you're saving money, you're competitive, and you're in this class of employer group of certain sizes that you service. But the next thing is going to be, you have really good service levels. One of the things that we talk about is, it's very old school brick and mortar, is we have a domestic 24/7, 365 multilingual call center. And people will be like, why don't you outsource that? I go, well, first of all, I think we have better service by controlling that narrative internally. And what I mean by that is, we're all in the same system. We'll talk about this, I'm sure, in a bit. Our system is called Judi. Judi, short for adjudication. She's the brains of our organization, but the junior call center analyst or representative is on the same system as our CFO and everyone in between. And this gives us complete visibility and control to the patient and plan experience. And so what we want to be able to do is deliver better service. And this means time to respond, first call resolution, and we have won tons and tons of award for call center. And it's so old school and brick and mortar, but it's so important, because if you have a problem, what does everyone do? You flip over your card and you call a number.
Yep.
You may try and resolve it on an app, but if you're trying to resolve something that's very complex, like I have a prior authorization for a new therapy, it's a biologic, I'm trying to work with my physician and the paperwork's missing, or you're not going to do this in a minute.
Yeah, there's a lot of complexity for some of these situations.
For some of these, absolutely. But these are the calls that come through usually. These are hard problems to solve, but you want the patient to have the best experience. So service is coming through more and more, and fiduciary concerns under ERISA, where there's this shadow or specter that, maybe we're not being served appropriately under the current model, that if you really had to look at what's going on for the last 25 years, these PBMs are making money on bad decisions.
Maybe you could go a little bit deeper on that. If we think about those areas where there are conflicts, and you highlighted the mail order pharmacy as an obvious one, but as you think about it, what are the other big buckets that have massive conflicts from the traditional PBM perspective?
Oh, well, let's start with the shared responsibility of formulary access. And so I always say, how is a formulary selected? And you would like to say words like efficacy and outcomes, and the reality is it's
nothing to do with pricing.
Well, it has to do with a pay-to-play system of market access, and I call it the prisoner's dilemma. This Nash equilibrium on drug pricing, and what I mean by that is, let's just to illustrate the problem with our formulary structure in the United States. And PBMs have no interest in changing because they make so much money. More expensive the drug, the higher the list price, love it. And think about it. So if you have two manufacturers, manufacturer A has a drug that has an annual cost, let's use specialty category, of $40,000 a year. and manufacturer B has one for $80,000 a year. It's twice the price, and they're let's say they're clinically equivalent. One might have a slight advantage, but it's never clear cut. Let's just say because they're second and third to market. They're pretty tight in their R&D phase. It's not like a generational lift on a drug, is my point. They're very competitive. Same indication, same everything. Which drug makes every PBM's formulary as their preferred? The $80,000 drug, not the $40,000. And you would be like, well, why wouldn't you pick the $40,000 drug? Because if they both have, let's just say, roughly 50% rebate and discount load, I want to make 20% on the $80,000 drug. I don't want to make 20% gross margin through vertical integration on the $40,000 drug. And so I was on the phone the other day with a pharmaceutical manufacturer, and they said, we made such a mistake a few years ago. We thought the industry was ready for the lower cost branded drug, and they got destroyed. No one picked up their drug because the PBM industry is so focused on the earning side. And so if you don't make money on drug spend, you don't make money on rebates, and you're just trying to make the best clinical decision and manage to low net cost, wonderful things can happen. And I feel like this is another example of that conflict of interest, that if they were prevented or just ethically did not make money on the drug spend side, they would choose formularies that are focusing on low net cost with equivalent or better outcomes. That's the goal. The other thing that we would talk about is you would stop having this one-size-fits-all formulary. I joke about this all the time. My sister and I are genetically similar, but have very different therapeutic needs. Yet, every person in the United States has the same formulary. If we're all members of X plan, we're all treated the same. That's absurd. And what we should be focusing on is what we call, precision medicine, and thinking about what's the best medication for Jonathan, what's the best medication for AJ, even in the same therapeutic category. I get migraines, you know what I mean? So what's the best drug for me? You may get migraines, but we are going to respond very differently to the different triptans in the class. And this is very important to remember. But in the current healthcare system, precision medicine doesn't have a prayer of evolving because nobody being legacy gatekeepers, wants it to move there because they lose their leverage. They want everyone to buy as a class and shop as a class and react as a class. But the reality is precision medicine would be better outcomes for everyone. And you still can manage to the appropriate price. And this is a myth that we can't control pharma if we were to move off this model. That's, again, absurdity. And I feel like this is another example of that conflict playing a role in holding back the industry.
Where does the responsibility fall in your mind of a benefit manager? So they obviously know that their formulary has the $80,000 drug versus the $40,000 drug. I mean, I don't expect every benefits manager to be savvy enough to understand which one might be better therapeutically or for clinical outcomes. But when does the responsibility kind of come back to the actual payer? The ultimate payer, maybe.
Under ERISA, if we wanted to read the letter of the law, it's always been the payer's responsibility.
But in reality,
I mean, so I always say legally, it's the fiduciary's obligation. So under ERISA, that's your plan sponsor. The person that is presenting the information, I'm going to say, is split again. You do have a consultant, and a consultant is providing you guidance, typically on your benefit plan in general, as well as your RFP. And we have spent a lot of time over the last 8 years educating consultants and collaborating with consultants. And for us, I think one of the things that we want to make note of when you ask that question is to say, I think the PBM's job is to say, oh, by the way, I'm trying to win this RFP. And it depends on which consulting firm is running it. If I have an evolved, enlightened consulting firm, this is going to be a joyful moment where we could talk about low net cost. We could talk about precision medicine in the future. We could talk about all these different drivers and options for you because it doesn't change our financial outcome. We're already bidding on this on a flat fee basis. I always want to always have people remember the job of the PBM is to say, how may I help you? But I want to educate you on what you could do, but I also have to navigate this RFP. And then you have people that are just like, look, highest rebate is going to win this bid. It is 75% of the value in a traditional RFP, maybe 80% at this point.
Really?
Oh, yeah. So whoever shows
Even
up,
in this day and age.
Oh, yeah. Whoever shows up with the biggest rebate check wins, but no one is contemplating low net cost in that scenario. Mm-hmm. They're just contemplating the biggest bucket of money coming over the line. Because remember, when we're doing an RFP, you're asked to reprice the existing drugs in the claim file. But there are some drugs I would never use. They're wasteful. These are branded products, and the generic's been available for 15 years. Why is someone filling this? You know, classic example, I don't know if you caught the interim PBM report from the FTC as well as some of the congressional oversight, and some of the drugs that they were, really focusing on were generic oncology, generic specialty, where these drugs have list price of $5,000 and $6,000 in a branded form, but the generic goes off at $180.
Right.
I would reprice it at $180 because I would be like, why am I using the branded
This
price?
is what we're going to fill with.
But the mistake, and back to the bias or the inherent conflict, is they just made a 6,000% markup on that drug. That may not have been a mistake. And I think this is the fundamental flaw that we've ignored for far too long. But the really, hopeful or great part or inspiring part for me is we're seeing the industry shift. I think people are waking up from this hangover and this reality of like, we've probably overlooked this for far too long. And what I mean by that is when I started in this industry in 2000, it was about $120 billion of top-line drug spend domestic in the U.S. We're going to clear $800 billion this year. That's 550% population shift to make an equivalent. So if we had same utilization, same price, that would mean our population has increased 550%. It's more like 30% over that same period. So no one can take a victory lap and say, I've kept drug prices down. But the PBM industry has said that for 25 years. We keep drug prices down. No, you have not. The case in point is, why is our drug spend at an all-time high every year? And there is a direct correlation to the 12 to 15% trend to the 12-15% increase in your earnings.
That's probably 1-to-1. I mean, there's probably some innovation in there as well, I would argue. That's probably not the main driver, but there's got to be a component of that. Well, things like CAR-Ts or gene therapy.
I agree the average price per script is going up, but we do have a limited patent cycle. You know what I mean? You're patent protected.
No, going back to
I would say if patents were like electronic devices, so if you come out with the iPhone, whatever we're up to, the 18, I don't know what we're up to at this point, but you're going to get 99 years on your patent. Depending upon when you come out of clinical trials and acceptance, you're lucky if you have a decade. You know what I mean?
Unless you're Humira.
Well, then you're creating
that's a whole
entirely...
that's
a different discussion for a different day, and I think perhaps the FDA has learned some lessons, hopefully, over the years on that. But I think the point of it is there's a real opportunity here for, I would say, the entire industry to benefit from a differentiated approach that goes back to serving the plan and the patient first.
So if I read between the lines, it sounds like you're saying the ultimate payer, the decision maker, has woken up or is more cognizant of the conflicts and is maybe trying to manage around them. But from a regulatory perspective, we've seen some stuff in the last year come out of Washington. We have a completely new administration. I guess from your perspective, knowing that this administration might do things a little differently than the past one, what would you tell them, or how would you educate them and recommend, what would you recommend they do to help fix some of these conflicts of interest?
I think there was some legislation that was circulated in December, and then for a variety of reasons.
The Warren bill?
Yes, correct. That didn't have the ability to kind of get the momentum that it needed. And it was obviously pretty tight with the election cycle and obviously the new administration coming in. But I believe those will be revisited. I do believe they had bipartisan support. I do believe one of the few bipartisan issues everyone agrees upon is drugs are a little bit too expensive. So I think there are two ways to solve for this. I think first, going back to just remove the conflicts of interest. If you want to be an administrator, administrate. I say that all the time. If you want to make money on drug spend, be a manufacturer, be a wholesaler, be a pharmacy, or be a rebate aggregator. But you can't be both at the same time.
I think maybe there's probably more. Maybe all three, all five.
Well, most people in the vertically integrated legacy PBM model own everything, at this point. And so the point of it is to say, I didn't necessarily, divesting of assets is a little extreme in the original bill, but I'm just saying a very simple solve or compromise is if you're the administrator, you just can't use your mail, specialty, and rebate services. No one's saying you have to get rid of them. So in the accounts where you're not the aggregator, someone can use or buy those services and you can compete in the market fairly in those areas. I think when you're on the buy and the sell side, and what I mean by that, the buy side representing the payer, because you're obviously controlling payments, and on the sell side, you are the fulfillment arm. You're the mail order, specialty, rebates. If you're on the buy and sell side, you just represent yourself at all times. And I think you need to make a stand. If you're the administrator, it is an awesome responsibility. I say this all the time, is you're performing hundreds of administrative tasks on behalf of the plan and the member, and that integrity has to be absolute. And I think this is something that has gone overlooked for far, far too long. So I think the first thing is, yes, I do believe there might be some legislation or regulatory oversight that could put better guardrails. I always want to make this fair. I believe that competition is the best medicine to improve an industry, and I think we're already providing that pressure and others as well. But I do believe that I'll always take a tailwind. The other side of it is, and this is something that I think Senator Sanders and other people have very clearly seen, which is we have other developed nations, Germany, UK, France, paying a fraction of the cost of the same medication. And this is something that goes back to the 1970s, where you have economic committees that basically set up tiered structure on pricing for drugs. And this is part of a greater trade negotiation. It basically says you're a developing nation, you should just pay the lowest price. And for somewhat elevated or developed, I don't like that term, but I'm just using what they have, is more advanced, you get decent pricing, and then the United States, you just get the worst. And in the 1970s, early 70s, the average price of prescription was $4.50. Fast forward to today, the average price of a drug is $130. More importantly, the highest priced drug back in the 1970s might have been $500 or $600. The highest priced drug now is millions for cell gene therapy. Take your pick, or even just good old-fashioned biologics can run $100,000 a year. And so no one foresaw this acceleration of cost. And this was very difficult for people to, work through, and we've ignored it for 25 years. But the example I like to give is, let's take, one of the hardest things in the world to do, which is to put a satellite into orbit. And I use this example all the time because I admire SpaceX, because if you go on their website and you click rideshare, and it'll start taking you through like a menu choice. It'll be like, how many kilograms would you like to put into orbit? 1 to 800, and what type of orbit, would you like to put it in, and et cetera. And at the end of your sequence, it'd be like, your cost is $3.2 million. If I can get a cost to put something into orbit, why can't I get a clear cost for everything else? But the important thing is, it doesn't matter if I'm in Germany or the United States making that request. It's the same price outside of currency conversion, perhaps. The other part of it is, let's take something really complex to build, like a GPU from NVIDIA, like a 4090 chip. I don't care where you're standing in the United States. The latest 4090 chip is the same price, any time of day. If I go to Germany, France, the UK, it's the same price. If I go to Australia, a 4090 is the same price. No one can tell me it's harder to make a biologic versus a 4090 GPU. I mean, these are extraordinarily difficult things to construct and architect. And so my point here is if we can have price efficiency in these areas of putting satellites into space to GPUs, we should be able to have fair, reasonable trade on drug spend. And so I do believe, if back to the original question, I believe it's removing the conflicts of interest. I also think there's a discussion. I don't think this is a demand. I'll leave that to the administration. But I think there's an equilibrium point, which is we're all developed nations here. You know, not to pick on Germany for a second, but if someone's getting a BMW, you know, and the list price is $40,000 in Germany, it's roughly $40,000 here. It's not $240,000 here for the same car. And that's what the drugs are. That's the delta. It's 5X, 6X. I mean, I don't know if you remember Senator Sanders, and he had the GLP-1s behind him, and he's like, Germany's paying $70. Our list price, you know, net of rebate is $500-600. That's not reasonable. So I do believe there's an equilibrium point, which is, does the world get to pay $70 for drugs in that same class? Maybe that appropriate price is $175 for everyone. And I think the United States has carried that burden for far too long. And so when this is the argument I hate, when someone says, you're going to kill R&D. I go, no one's paying for the R&D for NVIDIA or AMD, or take your pick of every other high-tech organization that has to create the next architecture. And you want to talk about one of the most competitive arenas in the world, semiconductor and GPU development and CPU development is incredibly difficult to keep up with everybody. And so no one's paying their freight. You know, like, hey, I'm going to pay $6,000 for a GPU with NVIDIA, and everyone else pays, you know, $700, $800. No, that I believe
it would never happen.
I believe the world needs to move off of this point. And so these are the two areas where I would focus my time on, you know, really trying to drive down the costs on drugs for everyone.
So really, to summarize, kind of like a reference pricing discussion in a lot of ways. Yeah. And I used to work in pharma back in the day, and I remember when we were talking about Europe, that was a very topical point. Germany versus France versus Italy, the more developed, you know, the big five in Europe. So maybe, you know, as we think about the U.S. system going forward, you know, it seems like we're moving to more transparency, at least on the generic side. It seems like there's a convergence there over the last couple of years. Is that a fair statement? You know, I think people used to think of it, and maybe you could tell me if I'm right or wrong, you know, generics were almost priced as a class versus the actual drug or molecule itself. But it seems like now we're getting to a place where there's a lot more transparency, and my Lipitor at Costco is going to be within range of my Lipitor at CVS or wherever I might go. Is that a fair statement?
It has gotten better, you know, and I will say that is, you know, I think a lot of the PBM industry has operated like a casino. In what it is, it's odds at any moment of acceptance of price. And if you think about it, statistically, you have greater than 92% chance of a patient accepting any price at the register. And those are pretty good odds. And so when you think about generic drugs, most plans, let's say statistically 55% of plans have a flat copay on generics, like it's $10. So it's copay island. So most people wouldn't know there was a shift. If you have a deductible plan, you would suddenly recognize, is my Lipitor $15 or $60? You know, because like, whoa, what happened there? So there is still price variability, because I look at claims data as it comes in and RFPs and everything, and there's still this variance. It still exists. Has the variance decreased? Has it, you know, become tighter? The answer is yes. But unfortunately, there's still a lot of noise, and there shouldn't be. You know,
like we on that 80-90% of scripts, like we should have transparency and visibility on it.
Well, it's probably 92%.
At
you know,
point.
for some plans for generic, you know, utilization. You know, so let's just say 90% of the drugs, it should be like reaching for a can of Pepsi or Coke. You know, this is $1. Like, if you charge me $8 for a can of Coke, I would begin to wonder what's going on. But I think that's the other problem with drugs, is because it's existed in such an opaque and dark world for so long. When someone is presented a price of $72, you're like, I guess that's reasonable, when it could be $2. And I feel like...
Yeah, there's not the same discovery mechanisms as there are in other
no,
industries.
and I think there's a lot of shared responsibility, in this kind of environment of the supply chain. But I do believe it's getting better. I agree with your point 100% that most consumers are becoming smarter shoppers too, which is, let me price compare through different services to figure out, is this a reasonable price? But
there's still a disconnect there.
Yes, there's still a disconnect.
But we're moving in the right direction.
We're moving in the right direction. And then branded product, I see less variance on the list price, but where you begin to see it is the net price, which is net of rebate, discount, coupon, other things that may be reducing cost. And this is something that's always bothered me, is when people say, I give like 100% of rebates, like, don't. And my point is, oftentimes when they say this, they're not talking about they're only talking about it from the lens of the PBM. Like, the PBM is giving 100% of the rebate that's available. What's the definition of rebate? It's a small r, not a capital R. But the other part of it is they're not talking on behalf of the parent organization and all subsidiaries. Who else took money out of that? You're just speaking about the
right.
pharmacy arm. The other part of it is, when we talk about net, is when I learned this when I was at my role as an auditor, if I were to look at a Fortune 50 company's rebates in the same year as, let's just say 1,000 life, 2,000 life case, their rebates are of a different magnitude. So if it's the same drug, why does someone have more money coming to them? And when you say you're passing 100% of the rebate through, well, that can't be. Are you either giving that other customer more money? Are you giving me less, or a little bit of each, and you're keeping the difference? And so unless everyone gets the same price, and that's the way it should be, you can't trust the system. And this goes back to that conflict of interest. So another area of distinction of capital R is everyone gets the same price. Our admin fee, going back to, we charge a flat admin fee, and it's $5 for a slightly smaller account, and it might be $4 for a slightly bigger account, but that's the only real...
And that's on each claim.
Yeah, or it could be PMPM. They're roughly the same. You have 12 months versus 11 scripts on average for commercial, so they're pretty tight either way.
Yep.
But the point of it is, when you get back to, that conflict of interest, there's no escaping it. You know what I mean? And this is something that bothered me for far, far too long, which is, why are patients and plans put in this position? They never should have been. And I think for us, we just always wanted to say, back to my Tylenol rule, you get the same price. Everyone has the same price until prices change nationally. And we don't set prices. We use NADAC, National Average Drug Acquisition Cost, as our reference. And we always tell pharmacies when we negotiate, you must at least be at this price, National Average Drug Acquisition Cost, or better. Some people have better prices, like Costco, for example. Lovely, have tons of generics that are lower cost. And they want to provide that lower. I'm all for it, but they love giving us the lower price because they know we're not encumbering it. I'm not going to then take their low price and mark it up 20%.
Sure.
And so I think everyone getting the same price is extraordinarily helpful, because it helps us, again, train the consumer and patient on what are real prices, so they can't be taken advantage of at the register. There's a layer of trust and integrity that's built in that no one is taking advantage of them. And I think, again, these are things that should not have gone on for the length of time they have.
Maybe an existential question here, switching gears, but if your model and others takes off, or is taking off, and we see more critical mass going to you guys versus the big three, what stops them from just acquiring the new model?
Yeah, so...
I think we've seen that story before in other spaces where a new flavor comes to market, it has some success, and now it becomes part of the bigger organization.
I was actually talking to a friend who's in finance the other day, and one of the things that we both observed was that there hasn't been a company that has achieved incumbency in healthcare in the 21st century. And what I mean by that is, There wasn't this little engine that we're an upstart search engine and we become Google and we become and displace everyone. Or, you could say there was someone who was, take your pick of everything from e-commerce to CRM to whatever. The new entrant achieves incumbency, becomes part of the landscape forever. We don't see that in healthcare very often.
I'm racking my brain while you're talking, trying to think of one, but nothing's coming to mind.
Well, we were both challenged by this, and one of the things that we began to think through was why. And I think part of it is there's a lot of friction to achieve incumbency because it's built on trust. Back to my earlier point, there are no shortcuts. You don't just get to knock on the door and service the largest payers in the country. So you have to earn that trust, earn that right, and re-earn it over and over again. And so I think that's the first part, which is many companies may not have the distance, the management team, the financing. And so it's this comfortable exit, which is like, you did a good job, you scrappy little company. Now it's time for you to retire.
Yeah, welcome to the big leagues.
Welcome to the big leagues. We're going to take over from here. We're going to help you out. We'll solve your EBITDA problem. We'll help you reach more people. And, it's who killed the electric car, what I mean, on some level back in the day. And so I agree with you with that observation. But I will say, thankfully, you're seeing a new generation of healthcare companies that are coming to market like us, and even on the medical side, other people, and extraordinarily well-funded, where you don't have to be exhausted by the headwind, that you can grow and grow responsibly. I think if there's one thing that came out of the pandemic and the halcyon days of people having crazy valuations and burning tons of money, was responsibility, which is, you're threading a needle between growth and appropriate earnings. And I think this is something that I'm fortunate that we were able to be part of that transition. And I think it's having strong investors backing your organization, being part of your board, agreeing to your mission, and allowing you the privilege. It's a privilege to try and achieve incumbency. And that's what we're doing is, we have, thankfully achieved a significant war chest.
I believe you guys have raised $250 million over the years, haven't you? Somewhere in that ballpark?
355 million.
Okay, so my number's off. I'm low.
And so, it was probably from the last raise, but I'm just saying is we have significant capital because we want the ability to have the runway, because remember, you're doing two things. You're investing heavily in R&D. A great example is we're about 1,100 employees at my company. A third of them are engineers, full stack, front end, DevOps, SecOps, take your pick, product team. You want to have the capital to achieve the mission, to grow productively in your segment. And this takes time, but you don't want to sacrifice innovation. I think the one thing I joke about is healthcare is probably the greatest market in the United States. People are like, why would you say that? I go, it's better than e-commerce, banking, real estate. And they're like, why? First off, it's an inelastic demand curve. Doesn't matter if it's boom times or a recession.
Very defensive.
Extremely. Other thing is drug prices, we just discussed, seemingly always go up, 120 billion to 800 billion. The other thing is everyone's premium goes up. Premiums don't go down. You know what I mean? Unless you lost people.
Provider salaries don't go down.
No. And so if everything is going up and you have this incredibly defensive industry, it's the greatest. You want to buy as much of it as possible. When people are like, I can't believe vertical integration happened, I'll be like, I can't believe it took so long, because if you're focused on the business end of it, it makes complete sense. You don't innovate, you consolidate. You buy every ounce of this footprint. And I think this is where the FTC, DOJ, Congress, people are starting to look into this and being like...
because it feels like they were very much asleep at the switch. And I don't know that anybody would have foreseen 20 years down the road that
no. I want to be
specialty
fair.
Pharmacy would be the size that it is today.
I didn't know what a PBM was, and I worked in pharmaceutical side for 8 years. I was like, what, pharmacy benefit what? And they're like, what do you do? I go, my life ends at the loading dock. We've made a pallet of Lipitor. We're shipping it to McKesson, Cardinal, Amerisource, Bergen. I don't have anything else to do with this. I just assume,
Yeah, right.
But
Medco, that's something Merck sold, but I'm not really sure what they did.
I'm not sure what they did, and it's almost, comical, where you could be industry and overlook these segments. So who am I to blame, someone from the FTC who's got to be, well read in so many different areas than forget healthcare globally, but digging into the niche of pharmacy benefits. I mean, not the greatest cocktail hour discussion topic, typically, but I think that's it. Is they just didn't understand. To your point, they were just. It seemed like a non-event, but it is an event, and it is a big deal now.
So, if we look out in 5 to 10 years, where do you think the industry is going to be?
So, I think we're seeing this tipping point of fiduciaries, employers, and plan sponsors understanding they need to have an aligned administrator. And I do believe you're seeing this unbundling of making money on drug spend through fulfillment and rebate and pure administration. I believe that trend will continue, and that will be commonplace going forward, at least for large payers. And small ones still might be bundled under some things, but I definitely believe that's the first place we're heading. I think the other area where we've been spending a tremendous amount of time on is this concept of unified claim processing. And, back to why did pharmacy go on its own little way and medical went on its way, and we do everything twice in the United States. We have pharmacy claim administration and medical. So this means you have 2 underwriting teams, 2 billing teams, 2 network teams, 2 reimbursement teams, 2 clinical teams, 2 call center teams. And every time you do something twice, it's usually twice as expensive.
Exactly.
And so we probably, depending upon how you calculate total market of U.S. spend on healthcare, let's just say it's $5 trillion. I would say there's at least $1 trillion in administrative waste. And we see it with pharmacy benefits. We effectively administrate a claim 70% cheaper than my competitors and find a profitable contribution margin there. I think the same is true for medical, but it's twice as bad because we're doing it twice. So why do we have these 2 workflows? I don't really care. It's why don't we put it on the same system? And first of all,
and you guys have.
That is, yes. So that's where, we started this journey 2 years ago, and we didn't really want to talk about it too much because if you fall flat on your face, you don't want the world to know about that. So we did a lot of it in stealth mode. But at the start of this year, we launched Unified Claims. So we already did pharmacy benefits, commercial care, CAID. But medical, obviously, we have about 1,700, 1,800 lives in our benefit plan. We're self-insured. So I said, well, why don't we do our own medical on our Judi platform? So at the start of the year, Judi went live. We're processing medical and pharmacy claims on the same platform now. And I often say, the best test of your system is your own family. So my wife and kids are on it. Everyone's families are on it. And everyone thinks it's amazing. It's a much better experience, much more efficient. And the reason why is we talk about when you define enterprise, you talk about enterprise software. Yes, that means scalable and secure, but it really means a single source of truth. You're managing multiple work streams on the same system. So everything understands, what I call important aspects, time and information. And
you have that ground truth all in the same place.
Exactly. So, you're no longer trying to merge files. You're no longer making decisions with half the information. There's safety concerns. There's how could you ever achieve the promise of value-based care and contracting if you can't see the medical and pharmacy in real time? So for us, we think unified claim is, when you talk about 5 years out, is going to be a huge part of improving healthcare. I'll never claim to be, I know what the best clinical solutions are or the best way to engage patients, but what I will say is we're the best plumbers in healthcare. We're going to give you all the tool sets that you need to administrate your plan as efficiently as possible and then deploy all those brilliant ideas. And so this is a huge part of it. And the last leg of it is, you talk about artificial intelligence. AI is an incredibly powerful tool set going forward for healthcare. But one of the things that we talk about is AI can be trained on lots of data, But one of the things that's very powerful about our Judi platform is it's now one place where you could observe medical and pharmacy in real time. And not just the claims coming in, but all the work streams, the call center information, the clinical, the billing, the reimbursement, the network. And when you start training a model, but Judi is not just read only, Judi is read and write. Judi does things. So if you have AI that's being trained on your system, yes, it's going to improve your variable cost and improve efficiency more. But the other part of it is a human being or a team of human beings will never be able to take in all these data points in real time. So if someone has emergency surgery, it's already queuing up the billing in the outpatient service. It's already thinking about your rehab. It's already contacting your primary care physician. The system is so far in front. And this is what gets me excited is I believe AI is going to drive even further advancement for patient care. And it's, again, at this fundamental administrative level.
That's great. Maybe we'll wrap up with one last question. So I like to end these with a little bit on a personal note. Is there a lesson from your personal life or your professional experience that really drives you day to day?
Driving me in this role, is I think the biggest one for me was coming out of my old company. And what I mean by this is I failed in my last role. And what I mean by this is there was this Netflix moment for me in my old company. And what I mean by this is I admire Netflix for many reasons besides being a subscriber, but I admire Netflix because think about it, 15 years ago, they were mailing us DVDs to our home. So they had to go to their board of directors and say, I have an idea. This thing that we're doing, mailing the DVDs, it pays for everything here, but I think we're going to sunset it. And we're going to start streaming old content to people's homes, and they'll pay us some, couple bucks to do this. And they won that argument. They went to their board and they said, I think we need to evolve, and this is the way to do it. And the board agreed. And then they went back to their board 5 or 6 years later and said, this was pretty good, but now I think we should become a world-class production house and make our own content. And they're like Sony and Universal, and they're like, yeah, take your pick, comedies to movies, we're going to do them. And they said, okay. And I think that's why Netflix is in the position that they are today, is they continue to evolve and continue to push that kind of frontier of entertainment and engaging with the consumer. I tried that at my old company where we were doing audit and procurement, and I was frustrated because I'm not solving anything. We built a decent business. But I'm like, hey, we're mailing out DVDs here. I think we should try and solve the problem. We need to change this. And I lost the argument. And that was humbling for me. And it put me on a very difficult path. And it's very scary to go back out and try again at any point in your life, especially when you got young kids and you're like, I'm going to start from zero again. But I had lost the argument, and I blamed myself for that. And it was a lesson that sat with me, which is if you really believe in the mission, you really believe what you were trying to explain to your old board, then go out and do it. And I think that has been a driving force for me, which is I never want to lose that argument again. I want to make sure everybody understands the mission. Everyone has conviction, from my junior employees to my senior management to my board of directors. And I want to make sure we are given every opportunity to execute. I'm back to having the runway, help have the strong balance sheet to set everyone's expectations on these timetables. And so I think this is one of the things that has really kept me focused and pushed me in, I don't want to say to the level of being maniacal, but it certainly pushed me. I never want to go through that again.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That was fantastic. I don't think I could have asked for a better answer. And now we have Capital RX. That's AJ Loyakino, CEO and co-founder of Capital RX. Thank you so much for joining us on our latest episode. And please make sure to click the follow button on your podcast app so you never miss a discussion with the leaders in healthcare innovation. I'm Jonathan Palmer, and you've been listening to the Vanguards of Health Care podcast by Bloomberg Intelligence. Until next time, take care.